Who gave her a rifle? The question exploded across the training range, followed by a wave of laughter that rolled through the crowd like a gust of mountain wind. Dozens of soldiers turned toward the source of the commotion. Some smirked. Others openly laughed. A few simply shook their heads as if they were witnessing a mistake unfold in real time. Standing near the equipment table, Olivia Hayes looked up from the rifle case she had been organizing. She did not seem embarrassed. She did not seem angry. If anything, she looked completely unaffected. The training range sat high in the Colorado mountains, where cold air drifted across the rocky slopes even in late spring. Targets stretched across the valley at distances most recreational shooters would never attempt. This was not a place for beginners. It was one of the Army's premier long-range training facilities. Every soldier there knew it, which was why the sight of Olivia carrying a rifle seemed so amusing to many of them. Sergeant Kyle Mercer leaned against a barrier with his arms folded across his chest. At 34 years old, Kyle had built a reputation as one of the most confident men on the range. Some called it confidence. Others called it something else. Seriously, he said, still grinning. Who signed off on that? More laughter followed. Olivia calmly secured the rifle case and continued checking equipment assignments. She wore the same support staff uniform she wore every day. No special patches. No elite insignia. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged among the experienced marksmen gathered around the range. To most people, she looked like an administrative assistant helping with logistics. Captain Nathan Brooks watched the exchange from several yards away. Unlike the others, he did not laugh. He simply observed. Nathan had spent nearly 20 years around military training environments. One thing experience had taught him was that appearances often told only part of the story. Still, even he knew very little about Olivia Hayes. She had arrived at the facility less than a year earlier and spent most of her time handling equipment records, scheduling support, and maintaining training inventories. She rarely spoke unless necessary. She never volunteered information about herself. She never tried to impress anyone. In a place filled with strong personalities, Olivia was almost invisible. Maybe she is practicing for a photo shoot, one soldier joked. Careful, another added. That thing probably weighs more than she does. The group laughed again. Olivia finished her checklist and handed a clipboard to a range technician. Lane assignments are ready, she said quietly. The technician nodded and walked away. That was all. No argument. No defense. No reaction. Somehow that made the laughter continue even longer. As the morning progressed, trucks arrived carrying additional equipment. Instructors prepared for a major training event scheduled later in the week. Soldiers moved between firing positions, maintenance stations, and briefing tents. Through it all, Olivia worked silently. Yet if anyone had watched closely, they might have noticed something unusual. Every time the wind shifted across the valley, her eyes instinctively followed it. Every time weather conditions changed, she glanced toward the distant ridgelines. Small details, easy details to miss. And nobody was paying attention. Nobody except Nathan Brooks. Because while everyone else was busy laughing at the woman carrying a rifle, he had started to wonder why she seemed more interested in the wind than anyone else on the range. By the following morning, the laughter from the previous day had already become part of the range culture. Soldiers repeated the jokes while cleaning equipment. Instructors exchanged amused comments over coffee, and more than one trainee glanced toward Olivia Hayes whenever she crossed the compound carrying paperwork or supplies. It did not seem to matter that she had never claimed to be a shooter. People had already decided who she was. And once people make that decision, they rarely look any deeper. The training facility came alive before sunrise. Cold mountain air drifted through the valley while trucks delivered targets and equipment for the upcoming long-range evaluation event. The competition was one of the most respected exercises held at the facility each year. Participants would be tested on observation skills, environmental awareness, and precision under changing conditions. Most of the soldiers had spent weeks preparing. Olivia spent the morning checking inventory records inside a maintenance building near the edge of the range. Through the open doorway, she could see distant ridgelines glowing beneath the early sunlight. A weather report rested beside her clipboard. Every hour, she quietly updated notes in the margin. Wind direction, temperature shifts, humidity changes, small details, details most people ignored. Around mid-morning, Sergeant Kyle Mercer walked into the building carrying a training roster. He stopped when he noticed the weather report. "Studying the forecast?" he asked with a grin. Olivia looked up. "Just keeping records current." Kyle picked up the paper and glanced at the handwritten notes. "You track all this yourself?" "Sometimes." "Why?" Olivia shrugged. "It affects the range." Kyle laughed softly. "Not your range." He set the paper down and walked away. Olivia returned to her work without saying a word. Later that afternoon, several shooters gathered on an observation deck overlooking the valley. Captain Nathan Brooks stood among them, reviewing preparations for the upcoming evaluation. Conversations drifted between equipment discussions and stories about past competitions. One retired instructor who occasionally assisted at the facility was sharing memories from years earlier. "Best shooter I ever saw trained here," the instructor said. Nobody believed it at first. Several soldiers looked interested. "What happened?" one asked. The instructor smiled. "Most people underestimated that person because they were looking at the wrong things." Kyle leaned against a railing. "Sounds familiar." More laughter followed. The instructor ignored the comment. "The best observers notice details others miss. Wind, light, terrain, tiny changes. Those things matter more than most people realize." Nathan found himself thinking about Olivia. He had noticed the same patterns. She seemed unusually aware of everything happening around her. Distances, conditions, timing. None of it fit the image everyone else had created. As the conversation continued, a strong gust of wind swept across the valley. Several range markers shifted slightly. Before anyone else reacted, a voice spoke from behind them. "The crosswind will be stronger after 3 o'clock." The group turned. Olivia stood near a supply vehicle holding a stack of maintenance forms. Kyle smirked. "You predicting the weather now?" Olivia glanced toward the ridgeline. "The clouds are building on the western side. It happens most afternoons." One of the instructors checked a weather application on his tablet. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Actually, she is right." For a brief moment, nobody said anything. Then Kyle shrugged. "Lucky guess." The group moved on. Yet Nathan noticed something important. Olivia had not sounded uncertain. She had sounded like someone describing something obvious. As the afternoon faded into evening, preparations continued across the facility. Targets were positioned. Equipment was inspected. Schedules were finalized. And somewhere beneath the routine activity, a quiet mystery continued to grow. Because while everyone else focused on the shooters preparing for the evaluation, nobody seemed to realize that the most interesting person on the range was the woman they kept overlooking. The annual long-range evaluation drew closer with every passing hour, and the atmosphere across the mountain facility began to change. What had once felt like routine training now carried an edge of anticipation. Soldiers who normally joked through equipment inspections suddenly took preparation more seriously. Instructors reviewed procedures repeatedly. Even the weather seemed determined to become part of the challenge. Thick clouds drifted over distant peaks, while shifting winds swept through the valley at irregular intervals. For most participants, the evaluation represented an opportunity to prove themselves. For Olivia Hayes, it was simply another day of work. She arrived before sunrise as usual. The facility remained quiet except for maintenance crews preparing the range. Olivia moved between storage buildings carrying inventory forms and equipment logs. Nobody paid much attention to her. That was normal. In fact, she seemed to prefer it that way. While most people were still finishing breakfast, she stopped near an observation platform overlooking the valley. The mountains stretched for miles beneath the pale morning sky. Olivia stood silently for several moments, watching low clouds move across the ridgelines. She closed her eyes briefly as the wind brushed across her face. Then she wrote several notes inside a small notebook and continued walking. Unknown to her, Captain Nathan Brooks had witnessed the entire moment from a nearby maintenance road. The scene stayed with him throughout the morning. There was something unusual about the way Olivia observed the environment. She did not simply look at the weather. She seemed to study it, understand it. Later that day, Nathan found himself reviewing personnel records in his office. The facility maintained files on every member assigned to the range. Most records were straightforward. Olivia's file was not. At first glance, it appeared ordinary enough. Administrative support, equipment management, logistics coordination. Yet several sections contained unusually vague descriptions. Certain assignments listed locations, but provided almost no details. Other entries referenced specialized training that seemed unrelated to her current responsibilities. Nathan leaned back in his chair. The inconsistencies were subtle, but they were there. Meanwhile, activity continued across the facility. Near the main range, groups of soldiers practiced observation techniques, while instructors monitored performance. Kyle Mercer remained one of the loudest personalities on site. He moved confidently among the participants, sharing opinions on equipment, conditions, and strategy. Most people listened. Kyle enjoyed that. During a break, several soldiers gathered around a picnic table overlooking the valley. The conversation drifted toward stories about legendary shooters who had trained at the facility over the years. One young specialist asked if any of the stories were actually true. An older instructor smiled. Some are. Like what? The specialist asked. The instructor glanced toward the mountains. Years ago, there was a trainee here who understood the environment better than anyone else. A sniper? Someone asked. Eventually, the instructor nodded. But that was not what made the difference. The difference was observation. Several soldiers listened carefully. That person could predict conditions before anyone else noticed them. Wind shifts, temperature changes, light variations, tiny details. Kyle laughed. Sounds like a weather station. The group chuckled. The instructor smiled politely, but did not argue. Maybe. The conversation ended there, but Nathan happened to overhear part of it while walking nearby. For some reason, the story immediately reminded him of Olivia. Later that afternoon, another strong wind swept across the range. Several flags changed direction almost simultaneously. Instructors paused to reassess conditions. Participants adjusted their notes. Olivia happened to be crossing the area carrying equipment records. She glanced toward the ridgeline and quietly changed the position of a loose weather marker before continuing on her way. One instructor noticed. How did she know? He asked softly. Nobody answered. The moment passed quickly. Yet another small question had just been added to a growing collection of mysteries surrounding the quiet woman everyone thought they understood. And somewhere beyond the mountains, the challenge that would change everything was getting closer. The morning of the evaluation arrived beneath a sky of shifting clouds and cold mountain air. Long before the first participants gathered on the range, instructors were already moving between observation stations and equipment checkpoints. The entire facility seemed focused on a single event. Every year, the long-range evaluation attracted attention because it separated confidence from preparation. Some soldiers arrived believing they were ready. Others arrived knowing how much they still had to learn. Olivia Hayes arrived carrying a stack of equipment forms. Like every other day, she moved quietly through the facility, checking assignments and verifying inventory. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged at the center of attention. That was exactly why what happened next surprised everyone. By mid-morning, participants had gathered near the main observation platform overlooking the valley. Instructors reviewed procedures while soldiers compared notes and discussed conditions. Wind continued to move unpredictably across the mountains. Even experienced shooters admitted that the environment would make the evaluation difficult. Kyle Mercer stood near the front of the group, confidently explaining how he planned to approach the exercise. Several younger soldiers listened carefully. Kyle enjoyed the audience. As preparations continued, one of the instructors announced that a demonstration would take place before the official event began. The purpose was simple. It would allow participants to observe environmental challenges before attempting their own evaluations. A murmur of interest spread through the crowd. Then something unexpected happened. A maintenance issue temporarily delayed one of the scheduled demonstrators. The instructor looked frustrated. Several officers exchanged quick glances. Before anyone could suggest an alternative, Kyle noticed Olivia walking past the equipment area. A grin immediately appeared on his face. "I have an idea," he said loudly. The nearby soldiers turned toward him. Kyle pointed directly at Olivia. Why not let her do the demonstration? Laughter erupted almost instantly. Some people assumed he was joking. Others realized he was completely serious. Olivia stopped walking and looked toward the group. The instructor raised an eyebrow. "She is support staff." "Exactly," Kyle replied. "It will be educational." More laughter followed. Several soldiers exchanged uncomfortable looks, sensing where the conversation was heading. Kyle continued. "Come on. She spends enough time around rifles. Let us see what happens." The crowd watched Olivia carefully. Most expected her to refuse. Instead, she remained calm. "I am working," she said. Cal spread his hands dramatically. See? Even she knows this is a bad idea. The laughter grew louder. Captain Nathan Brooks had been observing the exchange from several yards away. Unlike the others, he seemed more interested in Olivia's reaction than Kyle's comments. What stood out to him was not irritation or embarrassment. It was patience. Olivia looked as though she had encountered situations like this many times before. One of the senior instructors stepped forward. That is enough. But Kyle was not finished. What is the harm, he asked. Unless everybody is worried she might outperform us. The statement generated another wave of laughter. Yet something about the joke felt different now. Not everyone joined in. Several people had started noticing the same things Nathan had noticed. Olivia's understanding of weather, her awareness of terrain, the strange confidence hidden beneath her quiet demeanor. The instructor glanced toward Nathan. Nathan remained silent for several seconds. Then he looked at Olivia. Would you be willing to participate? The laughter stopped immediately. The question changed everything. For the first time, this was no longer a joke. Dozens of eyes shifted toward Olivia. Kyle's smile faded slightly. He had expected another excuse, another reason to laugh. Instead, Olivia looked toward the distant mountains, studying the clouds moving across the ridgelines. Then she returned her attention to Nathan. If it helps the evaluation, she said calmly, I can participate. A silence settled over the range. Because in that moment, what had started as public humiliation suddenly became something very different. And somewhere deep inside the crowd, people began wondering whether they had underestimated the quiet woman for much longer than they realized. The moment Olivia Hayes agreed to participate, the atmosphere across the range shifted in a way nobody could quite explain. A few soldiers exchanged amused looks, still convinced they were about to witness an embarrassing mistake. Others seemed curious. Captain Nathan Brooks watched quietly as instructors began making arrangements for the demonstration. What interested him most was Olivia herself. She showed no excitement, no nervousness, no desire to prove anyone wrong. She simply handed her clipboard to a technician and followed the instructors toward the firing line as though she were heading to another routine assignment. Kyle Mercer walked alongside several participants wearing the confident smile he had carried all morning. This should be interesting, he said loudly enough for nearby soldiers to hear. A few chuckles followed. Olivia did not react. Ahead of them, the mountains stretched across the horizon beneath a changing sky. Clouds drifted through the valley while wind continued to shift unpredictably between the ridges. The instructors had originally planned a standard demonstration target for the delayed shooter. Now, however, the discussion became more complicated. Since the crowd had gathered, several participants suggested increasing the difficulty. The idea spread quickly. Before long, everyone wanted to see something more challenging. One instructor studied a digital range map. We can place a target farther into the valley. Another shook his head. Most demonstrations do not go beyond 1,000 yards. Kyle smiled. Then maybe we should make an exception. The conversation continued while technicians reviewed available positions. Eventually, a senior instructor pointed toward a distant section of the range. What about the extended observation target? Several heads turned. Even experienced participants recognized the location. It sat far beyond the normal training lanes and was rarely used except during special evaluations. A low murmur moved through the crowd. Nathan noticed several shooters calculating the distance in their heads. None seemed particularly eager to volunteer for it themselves. The instructor checked the range data and nodded slowly. That would certainly make things memorable. Kyle folded his arms. Perfect. Olivia stood nearby listening without interruption. Finally, one instructor looked at her. You understand this demonstration is optional. I know. You can decline. I know. The instructor studied her expression. Are you comfortable continuing? Olivia looked toward the distant mountains. Wind moved gently across the valley floor. Several range flags shifted direction. She watched them for a few seconds before answering. Yes. The simple response surprised more people than it should have. Most expected hesitation. Instead, she sounded completely at ease. Preparations continued. Equipment was checked. Observers moved into position. Participants gathered along designated viewing areas. The event had started as a joke, yet now nearly everyone on the facility seemed interested in what would happen next. Nathan found himself standing beside one of the senior instructors. You have seen her work before? He asked quietly. The instructor nodded. Only around the facility. What do you think? The older man considered the question. I think she notices things other people miss. Nathan glanced toward Olivia. She was standing alone near the equipment area, reviewing environmental notes written on a small notepad. Nothing about her behavior resembled someone facing public pressure. If anything, she looked more comfortable than many of the train participants. Nearby, Kyle continued entertaining a small audience. Maybe she surprises us, he joked. Or maybe we finally discover why support staff belong in support roles. Several soldiers laughed, although not as confidently as before. Too many unusual moments had accumulated over the previous days. The weather predictions, the terrain observations, the mysterious knowledge she never explained. Questions had begun replacing certainty. As the afternoon sun slipped behind a layer of drifting clouds, the instructors finalized the setup for what would become the most talked-about demonstration in the facility's recent history. And while the crowd focused on distance, difficulty, and expectations, Olivia Hayes remained focused on something entirely different. The wind. The demonstration area fell unusually quiet as final preparations came to an end. Soldiers lined the observation platforms overlooking the valley. Instructors checked equipment one last time. Even the casual conversations that normally filled the range seemed to fade into the background. Everyone was waiting. What had started as a joke had somehow become the center of attention for the entire facility. Olivia Hayes walked calmly toward the designated position, carrying only the equipment she had been assigned. She showed no sign of anxiety, no sign of pressure. The crowd watched closely, searching for clues. Some expected nervousness. Others expected hesitation. Instead, Olivia moved with the same quiet confidence she displayed while organizing inventory or updating records. Captain Nathan Brooks noticed it immediately. The more attention she received, the calmer she appeared. That observation alone separated her from many experienced participants. Nearby, Kyle Mercer stood among a group of soldiers who had gathered to watch. He still wore a confident smile, but it looked slightly different now. Less certain, more curious. Over the past several days, too many strange moments had accumulated around Olivia. The weather predictions, the terrain observations, the unusual awareness of environmental changes. Kyle was not ready to abandon his assumptions, but for the first time, he found himself wondering if there was something he had missed. At the firing position, one of the senior instructors reviewed the demonstration details. The target had been placed at an extraordinary distance deep within the valley. The location had originally been selected only for advanced observation exercises because changing terrain and unpredictable wind patterns made calculations exceptionally difficult. Even experienced participants respected the challenge. The instructor finished speaking and stepped aside. Olivia remained focused on the landscape ahead. Her attention moved slowly across the valley floor, then toward the ridgelines beyond. Wind indicators fluttered in different directions depending on elevation. Small temperature shifts created subtle visual distortions above the ground. Most observers saw a difficult environment. Olivia seemed to see information. Several minutes passed. Nobody rushed her. Nathan stood beside two instructors, listening to their conversation. Look at her, one of them said quietly. She is not watching the target. Nathan nodded. She is watching everything else. The instructor glanced at him. Exactly. Across the observation area, soldiers continued following every movement. Some expected an embarrassing outcome. Others were no longer sure what to expect. The uncertainty itself had become fascinating. Then something unusual happened. A strong gust moved across the valley. Several range flags shifted direction almost simultaneously. Participants immediately began discussing the change. Olivia did not react right away. Instead, she watched the ridgeline for several seconds. Then she adjusted a note on the data card beside her position. The movement was small, almost invisible. Yet one of the instructors noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting, he murmured. Nathan heard the comment. What? The instructor pointed discreetly toward Olivia's notes. She anticipated the secondary shift. Nathan looked back toward the valley. Moments later, the wind changed again exactly as the instructor described. For the first time all day, Nathan felt completely certain of one thing. Olivia Hayes was not pretending to understand the environment. She genuinely did. As the afternoon clouds drifted across the mountains, the final stage of the demonstration approached. The crowd grew quieter. Conversations stopped. Even Kyle Mercer had fallen silent. Hundreds of eyes focused on the range, waiting to see what would happen next. Yet Olivia seemed unaware of the attention. She remained focused on the valley, the terrain, the changing air, and the countless details hidden inside the landscape. Because while everyone else was thinking about distance, Olivia was solving a much larger puzzle. And judging by the calm expression on her face, she already knew something the rest of them did not. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Clouds drifted slowly above the mountains while every person on the observation platforms remained focused on Olivia Hayes. Minutes earlier, the crowd had been waiting for a mistake. Now they were waiting for an answer. The change was subtle but undeniable. Nobody was laughing anymore. Olivia remained at the firing position, her attention fixed on the landscape stretching across nearly every visible mile of terrain. She studied the movement of grass along distant slopes. She watched the shifting patterns of air above sunlit rocks. She observed shadows moving across ridgelines as clouds passed overhead. To most people, the valley looked beautiful. To Olivia, it looked like information. Captain Nathan Brooks stood silently beside the instructors. The longer he watched her, the more convinced he became that she was operating from a level of understanding few people on the range possessed. Nothing about her behavior suggested uncertainty. She was not rushing. She was not guessing. She was calculating. Nearby, Kyle Mercer folded his arms and tried to maintain the confidence he had shown all week. Yet even he could feel the atmosphere changing. The crowd sensed it too. People who had spent days dismissing Olivia suddenly found themselves watching her with genuine curiosity. One of the instructors checked environmental readings and quietly shook his head. Conditions are getting more complicated. Another nodded. Most participants would be struggling right now. Nathan looked toward Olivia. She appeared completely calm. Then she did something that caught the attention of every experienced observer present. She adjusted her notes one final time and closed the notebook. No hesitation. No second-guessing. Several instructors exchanged glances. The gesture carried an unmistakable message. She had finished her assessment. The valley grew silent once more. A few moments later, the demonstration reached its conclusion. Observers looked toward the distant target area. Several seconds passed. Then confirmation arrived from the monitoring team positioned farther downrange. The results spread across radios, tablets, and observation screens almost instantly. For a brief moment, nobody reacted. The crowd seemed unable to process what they had just heard. Then conversations erupted across the facility. Soldiers looked at one another in disbelief. Instructors checked the data again. Several participants requested confirmation. The numbers remained unchanged. The outcome was real. Nathan felt a slow smile form as he watched the reactions around him. He was not surprised by the result anymore. What surprised him was how many people had never considered the possibility. Kyle stood motionless. The confident expression that had followed him through the week had disappeared completely. He stared toward the valley as though searching for an explanation that would restore his previous assumptions. None appeared. Olivia quietly stood and began organizing her equipment. That detail stunned many observers more than the result itself. There was no celebration, no dramatic reaction, no attempt to draw attention to herself. She behaved exactly as she had every other day. One young specialist finally spoke the question many people were thinking. Who is she? Nobody answered immediately, because the truth was that very few people actually knew. They knew she worked support. They knew she handled equipment and logistics. They knew she rarely spoke about herself. Beyond that, there was almost nothing. Nathan watched Olivia carry her equipment case away from the position. Something about the scene felt strangely familiar. Not the demonstration itself. The way she handled success. The absence of ego. The complete lack of surprise. It was as if she had been here before. Many times before. As the crowd continued discussing what they had witnessed, Nathan found himself thinking about the unusual personnel records he had reviewed days earlier. The incomplete assignments. The vague descriptions. The missing details. Suddenly those mysteries seemed far more important than before. Because one fact had become impossible to ignore. Olivia Hayes was not simply someone who understood long-range shooting. She was someone who had spent years mastering it. And somewhere inside a forgotten personnel file, Nathan suspected the real story was still waiting to be discovered. That evening, long after most participants had left the range, Captain Nathan Brooks remained inside the administration building reviewing personnel records. Outside, the mountains were fading into darkness beneath a cold Colorado sky. Inside, only a desk lamp illuminated the stack of files spread across his office. Olivia Hayes had become impossible to ignore. The demonstration had answered one question while creating several more. Nathan opened her personnel file again and slowly worked through sections he had previously overlooked. This time he paid attention to every detail. Assignment histories, training records, archived evaluations. Most appeared ordinary at first glance. Then he found a series of entries that did not fit. Certain records referenced advanced instruction programs, but provided no explanation. Several evaluations praised observational abilities at an exceptional level. One archived recommendation described her as possessing uncommon environmental awareness and extraordinary discipline under pressure. Nathan leaned closer. The language was unusually strong. More importantly, it had been written by instructors whose opinions carried significant weight throughout the military training community. He continued reading. Hours seemed to pass unnoticed. Then he discovered a supplemental archive attached to an older training cycle. The file had been moved years earlier and was not included in her standard personnel summary. Nathan opened it. For several seconds, he simply stared. Across multiple evaluations, one pattern appeared again and again. Top performance rankings, advanced long-range qualification programs, specialized observation certifications, consistent recommendations for elite development opportunities. Nathan slowly sat back in his chair. The quiet support specialist everyone overlooked had once been considered one of the most promising talents in an entire training pipeline. Meanwhile, across the facility, rumors continued spreading. Soldiers gathered in recreation rooms discussing the demonstration. Some focused on the distance. Others focused on Olivia's composure. Nobody seemed able to understand why someone with her abilities worked support assignments instead of occupying a far more visible role. Carl Mercer heard many of those conversations. For the first time since arriving at the facility, he found himself avoiding them. The jokes that once seemed harmless now felt different. Every new detail made his earlier assumptions look worse. Yet even Kyle still lacked the full picture. The next morning, Nathan requested access to several archived training reports. By midday, additional records arrived from storage. He reviewed them carefully. One document in particular caught his attention. It contained comments from a retired senior instructor whose name Nathan immediately recognized. The instructor had trained some of the most respected long-range specialists of the previous decade. Nathan began reading. The evaluation described Olivia as one of the most naturally gifted observers the instructor had ever encountered. Not simply talented. Rare. The word appeared twice. Nathan reread the passage. Then he opened another report. Similar language. Another recommendation. Another reference to unusual potential. The pattern continued. By late afternoon, the picture had become impossible to deny. Olivia Hayes had not stumbled into a successful demonstration. She had spent years developing skills most people never realized she possessed. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why had she walked away from that path? Nathan finally found part of the answer buried inside a final archived note. The document mentioned a personal request submitted years earlier. Olivia had voluntarily transferred away from highly visible assignments and requested positions focused on support operations and training infrastructure. No controversy. No disciplinary issue. No failure. Simply a choice. Nathan closed the file slowly. For the first time, he understood something important. Olivia had never hidden because she lacked ability. She had stepped away because she never needed recognition. The realization changed everything. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the mountains, Olivia crossed the facility carrying equipment reports exactly as she always had. Soldiers who passed her now watched with new respect. They still did not know the full story, but they knew enough to understand that the quiet woman they had dismissed for months was far more accomplished than anyone had imagined. And Nathan suspected the most remarkable chapter of that story had not yet been revealed. The final days of the evaluation passed more quietly than anyone expected. The excitement surrounding Olivia Hayes gradually settled into something deeper. Respect. Not the loud kind that comes from applause or recognition ceremonies. The quieter kind that changes the way people look at someone. Across the facility, conversations continued, but the tone had changed completely. Soldiers who once joked about Olivia now spoke about her with genuine admiration. Instructors referenced her demonstration when discussing observation and preparation. Even visiting personnel seemed interested in learning more about the woman who had become the most talked-about person on the range. Yet Olivia herself remained exactly the same. She arrived before sunrise. She organized equipment. She updated records. She completed every assignment with the same calm professionalism she had always shown. If the attention affected her, nobody could tell. One afternoon, as the mountains glowed beneath the golden light of a Colorado sunset, Captain Nathan Brooks found Olivia working inside the equipment building. She was reviewing inventory reports when he approached carrying a thin folder. "I thought you might want this," he said. Olivia looked up. Nathan placed the folder on the table. Inside were copies of several archived evaluations he had reviewed during the previous week. Olivia glanced at the documents and immediately recognized them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Nathan smiled slightly. "You know, most people spend their careers trying to build a reputation like that." Olivia closed the folder gently. "Maybe." Nathan studied her expression. Why walk away from it? The question carried no judgment, only curiosity. Olivia looked toward the open doorway where distant mountains stretched across the horizon. "Because eventually I realized something." Nathan waited. Being respected and being known are not the same thing. The answer lingered in the quiet room. Nathan nodded slowly. Somehow he understood exactly what she meant. Outside, activity continued across the facility. Participants prepared to depart. Vehicles were loaded. Equipment was returned. The annual evaluation was coming to an end. Later that evening, Olivia crossed the range carrying a final stack of reports. Along the way, several soldiers greeted her. Not because of rumors. Not because of archived records. Because they genuinely respected her. She returned every greeting with the same polite smile. Near the observation platform, she encountered Kyle Mercer standing alone beside the railing overlooking the valley. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Kyle exhaled slowly. "I owe you an apology." Olivia stopped. Kyle looked embarrassed. "Actually, I probably owe you 100 apologies." A faint smile appeared on Olivia's face. Kyle shook his head. "I thought I had everything figured out." "Most people do," Olivia replied gently. "Until they do not." Kyle laughed despite himself. "That sounds familiar." He glanced toward the mountains. "I spent weeks judging somebody I never bothered to understand." Olivia remained quiet. "You never once tried to prove me wrong," Kyle said. There was no reason to. The simplicity of the answer surprised him. It also taught him something he would remember long after the evaluation ended. Respect earned through actions lasts longer than respect demanded through words. As the sun disappeared behind the ridgelines, the facility grew quieter. Trucks departed. Buildings closed. Flags moved gently in the evening wind. Olivia walked toward the administration area carrying her reports, just another task in an ordinary day. Behind her, conversations continued among soldiers who would remember the evaluation for years to come. Not because of scores, not because of rankings, because they had witnessed a lesson far more valuable. The easiest person to underestimate is often the one who has already mastered the need for recognition. And as darkness settled across the mountains, Olivia Hayes disappeared into the routine of her work once again, leaving behind no speech, no celebration, and no demand for attention. Only the undeniable weight of quiet excellence.